to check out your bio on our website, and it's always there for people to check out later also. So I want to thank you very much for offering to speak. I think it's going to be a fabulous, fabulous presentation. I think it's a very worthwhile topic. So I am going to go and share my screen and get your presentation ready. Charles, if you'd like to take it away and talk while I do that.
Sure. So I'm actually going to defer introducing myself until I introduce the topic. I have it in the slide deck to do so in that order. But I also have a couple of housekeeping items due to the technical difficulty of my being able to drive this presentation. I've actually already shared the URL to the slide deck in the chat, and I will do so again for anyone joining too late to have seen that. So this information is available at any time. And the document itself is in Google Slides, as you can probably now see on the screen. And the document should be accessible. If anyone gets to it and finds it inaccessible, I can provide the information in a more accessible manner. So in keeping with that, the very first slide that I use here when presenting anything from a slide deck is to ensure that everyone can see what is being presented, who is here watching the presentation. I don't know, and perhaps Caroline, you can answer this, if we have any blind attendees today. So I'm assuming that everyone who's attending can see the screen.
I haven't been informed by anybody, so I'm assuming no, unless somebody would like to disclose before we start.
Okay. It is almost entirely text, and I will be reading all of the text. So if you can hear me, you'll get all of the information. And hopefully, if you cannot hear, you probably already discovered the captioning available inside of the application. And apologies if that isn't the case. So with that out of the way, the intent of this slide again is just if you can read this slide, then you can see everything else in the deck. And you can advance to the next slide, and you can put it in presentation mode if that's easier, so you don't see the film strip along the side.
Oh, yes, yes, sorry about that. Now, presentation mode is
up at the top right, present.
Should have done that earlier, sorry.
Perfect. So that gives us a little more screen real estate for the slide. So the topic that I'd like to talk about is functional needs for the web and beyond. And functional needs is obviously a term that could be interpreted a number of different ways. So let's first define that and why we're here. Next slide.
Oops. I think it went. Go.
Yep. Yep. You can go one more. And you can just use the arrow key to drive to the next slide. It should simply be right arrow to forward.
Yeah.
So in this context, what we mean by a functional need is this definition right here, which has consensus in the W3C working group where this work took place. And I'm going to read it out, and it'll make a lot more sense over the next couple of slides. A functional need is a statement that describes a specific gap in one's ability or a specific mismatch between ability and the designed environment or context. Obviously, that is not in plain and simple language, but it is relatively simple enough when accompanied by an example. Next slide. So the need in each case here is simply to use. So I need to use a thing. Next slide. The function in each case is the role of design and technology. So a functional need is the design and technology is serving the function of fulfilling that need. Next slide. The gap in each case is described in a way that could be either ability or context. Next slide. As an example, use without vision. Next slide. So here, use is the need of the design, and the mismatch is without vision. And the reason this language is carefully worded this way is because without vision covers all of the possible mismatches when a person cannot see. It covers a permanent disability such as blindness, a temporary disability such as an obstructed view or medicated. It covers a situational mismatch like too much ambient light glare, or a contextual one in which the image did not load. Next slide. So use of the design without vision is the intent of the statement. It's the function of design to solve for use when a person cannot see the design, regardless of the reason why. Next slide. So who am I? Next slide. My name is Charles Hall. I'm speaking to you tonight from Detroit, Michigan. I've been in the design arena since before the web, and I've been developing on the web since it existed. I am currently a senior accessibility designer at CVS Health, but I am not here in the capacity of representing them. This work is my own and part of my contribution to work within the W3C, where I am an invited expert of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group and Silver Task Force. And I am also the chair of the Inclusive Design for the Immersive Web Community Group. And here in my city of Ferndale, just outside of Detroit, I am a member of a city government commission for accessibility and inclusion advisory. Contact information accompanies my image over here on the left. This is a picture of me in Japan for W3C TPAC meetings. TPAC stands for Technical Plenary and Advisory Committee meetings, which took place in the fall of 2019. You can find me on Twitter at Charles Hall and on LinkedIn at Hall Charles. Next slide. So when I finish reading the slide, you can just hit next, and we'll breeze through this section. I've given previous talks on the language of disability, so this section of information proved useful to sort of set up the background of the body of this work. But before I read through all of these models of disability and then get into the functional needs, I'm going to pause the slide presentation portion here just to give you some additional background on the origin of this work. And within the W3C, there is a relationship between groups where a working group is a body that produces specifications and technical recommendations. So the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group is the body responsible for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's the charter of that group to provide technical specifications. Within a working group are task forces, and a task force is dedicated to usually a specific topic within that body of work. For example, in the Guidelines Working Group, there is a task force for cognitive accessibility. There's a task force for low vision. There's a task force for mobile. And there is a task force for what's called Silver, which is now the group whose charter is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 3.0. So in the context of that task force work, one of the things that the WCAG 3.0 is aiming to do is serve more needs of people. In order to do that, we needed to officially identify what all of those needs are. So this collection of functional needs is that body of work, and a draft to identify a more comprehensive list of functional needs for which guidelines can be written. So I'm going to read through these models of disability relatively quickly because I believe everyone who is attending probably has a general understanding of this. Next slide. So first we have the medical model of disability. Next slide. And the medical model views a disability as a problem of the person, directly caused by disease, trauma, or other health conditions, which therefore requires sustained medical care in the form of individual treatment by professionals. Next slide. The problem is in the person. Medical care is viewed as the solution. So the medical model seeks to fix or change the square or adapt the square to fit through accommodation in the square peg round hole model. The social model of disability varies rather distinctly from the medical model, where it recognizes that a person cannot be broken. We only become disabled when we encounter a gap between the designed environment and our ability. The problem is in the designed environment. So again, medical model, problem is in the person. Social model, the problem is in the environment. So in the social model, design is viewed as the solution. The social model seeks to never have a hole in the first place. Then we have the legal model of disability. and I understand this event being hosted in Canada. There's slightly different legal interpretations between the ADA and the AODA and the new Accessible Canada Act, but they're very similar civil rights laws. So the Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. This includes people who have a record of such impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded as having a disability. And finally, we have a complex model of disability. This comes to us from the World Health Organization, who states that disability is an umbrella term covering impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. An impairment is a problem in the body function or structure. And in this case, they intend body to also mean brain. An activity limitation is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or action. While a participation restriction is a problem experienced by an individual in involvement in life situations. So disability is thus not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interactions between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. Overcoming the difficulties faced by people with disabilities requires interventions to remove environmental and social barriers. So taking all of these models of disability into account, we can remove all of the stigma associated with the name of a disability or identity language and specifically address the need. So we have language that states the need without the identity. Such as usage without a pointing device, usage without vision, usage without photoreceptive issues, usage without emotionally triggering content. Which covers permanent, temporary, variable, situational, and contextual needs. And the scope of disability, by all conservative estimates, is over 1 billion people worldwide. But anyone is disabled by a mismatch between a design and their ability. So that billion people worldwide is permanent and temporary disabilities who have a diagnosis or are regarded as having a disability. So 1 in 4 people have a disability, but 4 of 4 have an access need, which covers all of the situational and contextual needs in addition. So here is an opportunity to pause and catch up with any questions that may be in chat. Do we have any?
Mary, are you watching chat? I'm doing the slide presentation.
I don't see any indicator on the chat icon.
Nobody chat yet. No
Okay.
chat.
All right. So I'm going to read through the list of functional needs. and I'm going to caveat the first one as I broke my own format of the definition. The needs are categorized as essential, sensory, physical, cognitive, and independence. The very first need under the essential category, next slide, is use without harm or risk. Now this doesn't follow the definition already provided. This is one that we are struggling to phrase in a way that is consistent language with all of the rest of them, while also serving to be a higher order principle. The goal here is regardless of or inclusive of all of the rest of the needs identified here, I need to be able to use a thing without harm or risk. It's sort of like the a basic principle of do no harm. Okay, so all of the rest of these follow the template format. The sensory category has quite a few. Next slide. So the body of work that this list of functional needs is representing is approximately 30 different documents that already existed within the W3C and around a dozen or so from external sources, including the most significant external source, which is the Harmonized European Standard, or EN 301549. And that list contains 11 different needs, the EN standard. And those 11 different needs are what all of the current accessibility guidelines are written against. In fact, they appear in laws around the world. To give you a perspective of the difference here, while the EN standard had identified 11 different needs, this list has 52. So we're trying, again, to cover additional needs that have been marginalized in the past. So the indicators here in purple numbers align to those that exist currently in the EN standard. So use without vision in EN is usage without vision. It's the very first one. So where you see the ordered list numbers 2 through 8, those are the numbers from our functional needs list. The purple ones 1, 2, 3, and 9 are those corresponding with the EN standard. So just within vision and visual sensory needs, we have use without vision, use with limited vision, use without color perception, and use with limited color perception. You're starting to see the theme here, right? There's total lack and there's impaired. Use with limited depth perception, use with limited orientation or spatial tracking, and use with photosensitivity. Next slide. Continuing in sensory, we have hearing and auditory, which are use without hearing, use with limited hearing, use with limited auditory processing, which is speech, and use with sensory neural hearing loss, which is a limited frequency range. Next slide. And then we have intersections between those, so vision and auditory, vision and hearing. So use without vision and hearing is a sensory intersection. I can be both blind and deaf, not previously covered. Use with vestibular issues, and use without spatial auditory awareness or perception, And basically what that means is a person cannot understand the source of a sound. Next slide. Now we have the physical primary category, which includes mobility, so use without mobility, use with limited mobility, and use with limited reach or range, that last one having been identified in the EN standard, but not the other two. Then we have motor, use without hands, use without multiple touch point gestures, or the ability to put more than one digit on a screen at a time, or any physical interface. Use with limited strength, which in the EN standard is use with limited strength and manipulation. Use without fine point control, use without physical tracking speed, or use with tremors. And now we have physical and sensory intersections. So use with limited tactile perception or sensory processing or touch pressure sensitivity is both physical and sensory. And use with chronic pain impacting input or interaction modality. Speech is within the physical realm because we have use without vocalization, so I can produce no sound. That was covered in the EN standard. Or use with limited vocalization or volume, so I can produce sound but not enough to register for any interaction device. A cognitive primary category was disappointingly lacking in every previous standard. So for all of the issues within the realm of cognitive, the EN standard had a single functional performance statement that said use with limited cognition, which is simply inefficient. So we have now a number of subcategories and needs identified within them. Within attention, we have use with limited ability to focus attention, use with limited ability to direct attention, and use with limited ability to shift attention. And hopefully the distinction between those three are clear. Focus means I have the ability to be presented with three things and keep my attention on one of them. Direction means I can follow the direction to get to the one. I can take a cue and keep my attention on the one that that matters. And shift attention is the ability to progress through something and focus attention on thing one and then thing two, etc. Language and literacy. We have use without the ability to read, use with limited ability to recognize written language, use with limited ability to comprehend written language, and use without ability to write. Continuing in that subcategory, we have use with limited ability to correctly write or type words and use punctuation, use without understanding symbols, and use without understanding metaphors, idioms, euphemisms, or specific dialect of culture or location. Under learning, we have use with limited ability of math and numeric concepts, use with limited compositional skill or simultaneously thinking and input, use with limited coordinational skill, motoric skills, visual, spatial, organizational memory, and social. Next slide. Memory issues, use with limited short-term or working memory, use with limited medium or long-term memory, and use with limited sensory memory. And under executive cognitive issues, we have use with limited planning, organization, sequencing, and execution ability. use with limited emotional control and self-monitoring, and use with limited judgment. And finally, we have mental health, rounding out the cognitive category with use without debilitating fear or anxiety. Next slide. I'm sorry, finishing off the cognitive primary category, we also have the intersections. Use with interocular transfer of visual memory. And this is really hard to explain, but it occurs when a person has use of only one eye, and the way that visual information is stored and processed gets transferred as if it came from the other eye. And that could affect someone's ability to differentiate right from left, for example, in remembering where a control is or following an instruction of a control. Use with limited phonological or phonemic awareness. And finally, we have the last primary category of independence, which has a couple of needs. And these are, they sound like a goal, but again, this is written as the gap. So use without autonomy or agency basically means I have to be able to use this thing if I am not in control. In other words, I may have a person assisting me in performing a function, so I don't have control. I have an agent on my behalf, which then also raises issues of privacy. Again, if I am not the sole actor and I have another person present, I need to be able to use that thing without privacy. Privacy is used as a lone word in the EN standard with very little consideration for how that it gets interpreted and used, inherited in the regulatory environment and other standards. So it largely gets ignored. But privacy is a huge personal need, so we've included in this list. So that rounds out the list of 52 functional needs we've identified from all of the existing documentation, both within and outside of the W3C, that address all of these needs. We are at a point in discussion right now within the working group on getting a deadline for public comment and officially making this an editor's draft and publishing it so that we can actually receive public comment through the W3C channels. But this is a preview before that happens. I'm opening it up to all of the communities that I engage with to get their comment. So presenting this is intended to be a precursor to what comes next, as well as an opportunity to get some conversation around it and understand if there are still needs that are not represented here. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A.
So will I close the presentation, Charles?
Yep, the only slide remaining is the one that has the bit.ly URL for the deck. So you can drive to the end and show that slide, or we can just leave it in the chat. So it's bit.ly/functional needs.
And I will send that out, the thank you attending email. I'll make sure to put that in there too. So, close that, go back. Okay, let's.
So I understand a list of 52 items is a really long list to try and comprehend and remember what you just heard and saw. So I'm happy to repeat any of them as part of the questioning, but if you saw something that you didn't understand or heard something that you didn't understand, I'm happy to take a stab at answering that. And what I'm most interested in is what wasn't on this list. If you have a need or you have identified a need that you did not hear represented here, I would really love to know about it.
I'm not sure if in the hearing, when I lost the hearing in my left ear, it was actually, I've lost everything. They put the ear back on. But it's not just being deaf and only hearing from one side. I've lost directional hearing, which means I don't know where the sound is coming. So somebody could be talking to me and I'm looking, where are they?
Yeah.
Or I'm looking,
Yep.
say like there's one of the hospitals downtown and there's 8 elevators in the main lobby.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
And I'll hear the ding, but then I'm looking. And there's times when I've had people go, forget it, if you're too stupid to pay attention, and they close the elevator on me.
Oh,
Because they think I'm being stupid, but it's just because I'm trying to figure out where the sound is.
Yeah. So do you find that inability to identify the source then impacts other sensory awareness? So in other words, does it create a domino effect of impairing you further?
It does, if I'm in a new place, it'll certainly add to my anxieties. So then I'll make, I'm talking myself down from an anxiety attack, which could then lead to other things, so.
Absolutely. So I do have the initial, so I do have the initial need covered in the one that I read, sensory neural hearing loss. Basically covers that gamut of directional awareness and inability to identify the source of a sound. And that is particularly key for the work that we were doing in the XR space. So imagine using something like a VR headset where there's spatial audio, and it's important to understand that the sound is behind you. So people that cannot perceive the direction of sound or the source of sound would need some other cue to indicate the direction.
Correct. So like at our bicycling committee, so at the City of Mississauga, I sit on the Accessibility Advisory Committee. But like with the bicycle committee, I went to them one time and they were talking about everybody has to make sure they have a bell. You use a bell, people get out of your way, or maybe they're just deaf or they don't give a damn. And I go, or someone like me who doesn't know where you're coming from. So it startles me and then I'm looking. So I hate when people don't stay, walk to the right, stay to the right in your direction. If you're in the UK, you would have to go to the left. So when people don't follow that, it can throw me off because now I'm not sure where you're coming from.
Got it. Yep. So I can say that scenarios like that would most likely be aided by a visual cue. So intersections of visual needs and auditory needs are also accounted for in this list. but you identified something that's not, and I'm not sure how to address it yet, but I'm going to have a deep think on it, which is the intersectional needs of the auditory issue with anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, people always assume we have a disability. I
Correct.
actually have
Which is
23. So one can trigger 2, 3, 4 the others, or they can exasperate it. You know, and then if I have a panic attack, it may trigger the tinnitus, and then that just really blocks a lot of my sound.
That's all super useful information. Are there any, I don't see anything in the chat, and I can't see the hand raise feature, so I'm not sure if there's any questions out there. If there's nothing in chat, I would invite you to just unmute yourself and jump in and ask a question.
Hi, Charles. This is Marcella. Thank you again for your presentation. It was really informative. I work in accessibility as well, so I'm really interested in this. And I just wanted to clarify the master list that you just gave us. I know you mentioned it. The purple numbers were for like 2.0, or like what was the difference between the black and the purple numbers again?
Yeah, okay. So the purple numbers are the numbers that correspond to the Harmonized European Standard, which is EN 301549. Okay. And that standard is used in accessibility laws in the EU, in the CRPD, which is a United Nations treaty. They are used in ISO standards. They are used in the UK accessibility laws, so they appear in a number of places, and even the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group has referred to them throughout the creation of WCAG. So they're not a W3C standard, they're a global standard from the EU, but they're used everywhere. So those purple numbers are the 11 needs that are identified in that list. So you can see, like, having referred to 11 needs for the past 20 years is insufficient. So we're trying to close the gap.
Thank you.
Particularly in the area of cognitive needs. So this has long been a contention inside of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and particularly the COVID Task Force in that group, where the success criteria of WCAG only account for a couple of cognitive needs. And the reason is not because we are not aware of the needs. The reason is we haven't come up with a way to write a testable statement in the format of the current success criteria in a way that is measurable and repeatable, because there's too much nuance in cognitive needs. So the only way that these cognitive needs are going to be addressed is dramatically changing the format that the guidelines are written in. So that is part of the scope of WCAG 3. Is to break away from the success criteria editorial format and come up with a different way of describing a guideline. By coming up with that new way of describing it, we're pretty confident that we can get more needs worked into it.
I think that that's really important because, so I work in post-secondary, I work in accessible learning services as an assistive technician. So I train students in assistive technologies. And most of my experience has been with students or with individuals with physical disabilities. And I find that the physical disabilities sometimes tend to be a little bit easier to target because we know what is missing. right? What's the barrier? But the cognitive disabilities, that's when we encounter so many variables and so many different diagnoses, and even within the same diagnosis, so many different barriers that they encounter. So I totally understand how hard it is to include that in a guideline and being able to make it a testable option as well, right? Something that we can repeat and make sure that if you include this, then it will actually target the majority of individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're trying to solve a number of things in WCAG 3. So the scope is pretty grandiose and ambitious. We're changing the format, we're changing the governance model so that it can be updated more frequently. We're changing the editorial style so that it's written in plain language. And we are dramatically growing the list of needs that are covered. So I have a feeling that we're going to heavily rely on the governance model of more frequently updating it, because there's no way we're going to get everything that we're trying to do in a first release. It's the most ambitious project I've ever seen. So before we can do some of that work, we need to make sure that we're all aligned to the needs that we're trying to accommodate. So in order to do that, we have to describe them.
It's that old saying, we don't know what we don't know. Alex has a question.
Sure. Hey, hope you guys can hear me. So I wrote the question down in the chat, but I'll just state it anyways. A little bit late, just read your slides. Fascinating stuff, and I really appreciate that commentary on sort of the audio mixing with spatial awareness, because that's a big thing that often gets neglected. I was just wondering, in case I missed it, I know that there's research in sort of the autism ADHD space where sensory input can be overwhelming. There was some research that showed that being able to have direct, either tactile or direct control over audio inputs has a much bigger impact on the ability to focus, where otherwise it would seem, music helps some people study. Why doesn't it help those that need it to sort of focus? There was just an interesting bit of research around sort of direct audio control, and I don't know if your guidelines speak to that or not.
They don't. So that was a similar piece of input from Carol Ann's story, where it sounds like we need to more specifically address some of the intersections between sensory and cognitive, where we only have a couple identified, and it sounds like there's some more work to be done in that area. But you mentioned something else in there that I want to address, because it's an area that we are very much aware of and paying close attention to, and it comes up repeatedly in conversations within the working group. The sort of total cognitive load. So there are a number of cognitive needs, not just autism and ADHD, that are impacted by the total amount of information that needs to be processed, sort of like the death by 1,000 cuts scenario. So a individual barrier, it has a different human impact than 100 of them. So the cumulative effect is something that we're very, very aware of, and we're trying to find a way to articulate within the methods, within the guidelines. But I don't think it's something that we could write very simply in a functional needs statement, but I'm open to be proven wrong. If it's something as simple as um, use with repeated interruption, or use with being cognitively overwhelmed, or if there's some concise way to articulate that, I'm very open to it.
Definitely worth giving thought. I think actually what maybe you've hit on, because making something that's universal or that applies to a lot of different cognitive styles and limitations, I almost would hope that some of the learning from COVID and the amount of remote technology that's being explored, maybe that could be like a mediator to find that happy balance in large groups. But that's just thinking out loud.
Yeah, so one of the general premises behind needs that might conflict. So within the cognitive category, in order to accommodate one need, you may possibly interfere with another need. The challenge there is also something that we're fully aware of. However, the solution is generally simple when needs conflict, which is defer to the user's control. So the general principle and the methods that support that principle is let the user consume it in a format that works for them so that they have customization over it, versus force it in one format that may favor one need and interfere with another.
Amazing. Thank you.
By the way, I'm a total nerd for this stuff, so I really love hearing the questions.
So bring on the questions, people.
Or comments or feedback saying that I got it wrong.
Just one thing in particular I wanted to bring up, and if somebody's on a mobile device right now, the 3 dots doesn't have the hand. So I think it's good that you mentioned just unmute if you can at this point, unmute yourself and ask the question. The question, it could get convoluted, the kind of answer, but I like that I saw privacy in there, but I'm trying to think in my head, my brain kind of scatters and thinks about all the different ways we need privacy, but I was kind of.
Yeah, so your audio is breaking up.
Just some examples of privacy that maybe we're using today. Other than just masking a field, can you hear me now?
Yeah, so I lost a bit in the middle there, but I think your question is addressing the fact that we all need privacy, right? So we need privacy, and there are a number of external laws that guarantee that privacy to us. The functional need, or the functional need as written in this draft, is trying to address people that don't have privacy and still need to use a thing. So it's trying to cover the gap when privacy isn't an option. So, for example, if I am incapacitated in a hospital bed and I need another agent on my behalf to enter information or to hit confirm on something that releases my care, I need to be able to perform that function, and I have no privacy to do it.
I got it. Thank you. I just need an example to like lock on to, but like, oh, here's one case. Yeah.
Right. To solve privacy for people that have it, I have a number of ideas, and I'm happy to have that conversation, but that's outside of the scope of this functional need.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I understand the importance of the need. I just was looking for the, commonly in people's mind hearing this kind of lecture. Yeah.
I see two hands up. Alex, I think you were first, and then Marcella.
If it's within the scope of this conversation, I just wanted to ask something to expand on the privacy point. So one of the main areas that I look at in my advocacy work is learning settings and employment. And one of the big questions, especially in academia where they have the accessibility offices sort of very well developed, is when disclosure happens, how that's negotiated, how accommodations might be brought up, and then sort of when it's actually maybe a disservice not to disclose versus a disservice to disclose. So if that's within scope, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I didn't mean to imply in the previous answer that any topic is out of scope. I just meant that it doesn't align to the need as we wrote it. I think I understand your question, so I'm going to reiterate what I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. The question is, when does use without privacy occur? And in the context of the asking for an accommodation from a university, I may or may not have privacy because it's variable. Did I get that right?
That especially, and then in employment settings where hiring, there's always that bias. A lot of the bigger companies will have a checkbox to say, is there a disability to report? But you can't really always account for how a manager or HR might see that. So it's just that tension of when the safe time is to disclose and when it's necessary. But yeah, what you said is also accurate as well. Yes.
Yeah, so the short answer then is I don't know. In order to have design and technology solve the need, there has to be a method that acknowledges the person doesn't have privacy in a specific context. So I would imagine it would be something similar to current terms and conditions and privacy disclosure laws that have to occur in the context of a form. So it could be as simple as language added in the context of that option. But then that gets super complicated because the law is different in every country.
Right. Right.
Great question. I'm not sure.
No, that's fair. I just didn't want to hog the speaker from the other questioner.
Could I answer that question? Because, like I know I worked as an employment counselor, and when we work with people with disabilities, and we have to ask them what's the disability in order to be accepted in a program. Now, that's where the privacy is not there, but the thing is, I always, when the person says, well, instead of asking them what the disability, what accommodations do you need to be successful in the workplace? So I try to do it in that way where the person's not, going to tell me the full disability, but they will tell me if there's something that they need to be successful, whether it's that overformed care or if it's mental health issues, is it something that, they're going to need more time, for doctors or time off. So you try to put it in a way that you can help them with the accommodation, but then when it comes to they ask me, okay, when I go to my employer, like when I go for a job interview, what am I, do I have to disclose my disability? And I always say, well, if it's a barrier into employment, the barrier to what you're doing, you might have to put it in a way that, okay, I'm unable to do this part of the work because of my disability or something, if it's a physical, but I can do this. So you try to gear it towards, okay, I could accomplish this, or maybe I can't do that, but I could do this because I'm able to do it. I have the skill. So you try to work it towards that. I might need a rest period, but then right after I'm alert and I'll be able to finish my job, things like that. So, in a way, even for employers, when you're working with an organization with disabilities, and the employers know they're getting someone with a disability, the one question I always suggest for employers to say is there anything you need to be successful in your workplace? Because they're not directly asking you that, I know you have a disability, what is it? They're just asking, is there anything that can accommodate? So the privacy is still, it's still on the side of the person with a disability. They might just need to say, well, this is what I need, and that's all I need. It's accommodation. So, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
suggestion.
So it's obviously a complex social issue, but perhaps similar to the global conversation we have within the disability community about identity language. We can start advocating for needs-based language in those contexts, right? So the whole editorial purpose of this exercise is exactly that: to identify the need without identifying a disability or a ability limitation, just the need, the gap between what's there and what needs to be there. So maybe the needs first language should become part of our social dialogue over identity language.
I like that.
I can speak to the post-secondary accommodations actually. In post-secondary, at least in the office I work at, students they do not need to say what disability they have unless they're asking for specific accommodations where we do need more information and an assessment to be able to grant them. So if, for instance, if a student comes into the office and says, I have a disability, but they choose not to disclose what disability, they can get the standard accommodations. But if they're asking, for instance, for memory aids or any other specific accommodations, for our office, they do need to provide an assessment or like a medical form. But outside of our office, they do not need to disclose. The accommodation letter covers everything and it's completely private. It's their choice. They just talk to the professor and say, I have an accommodation letter, but they do not need to say, because this is my disability.
Yeah.
So only the people from our office knows in that situation, but no one else in the college or university need to know unless the student decides to disclose that.
And that's very similar in employment law as well. And there's a lot of nuance there in different countries as well. But what occurs to me, there's nothing in this list of functional needs that can address that. But there is other work going on in another group that could potentially solve that context switching problem where in the accessibility in VR communities and XR, we are working on a way to make all of a person's preferences and configurations and settings portable, so that if I have to go and configure my captions to always be anchored at a specific location with a specific font and a specific color, and go through all that setting and configuration, and then I have to do that every time I go from device to device, that is a lot of barrier to entry, and it's a lot of personal configuration that I'm going to make the same setting for. So it would be far more frictionless of an experience if I could just take all those preferences with me from device to device and environment to environment. So the same technologies and APIs that are going to enable portable preferences could solve that context problem, where I report the disability that I have, the accommodation that I'm requesting, and the specific functional needs that I have, all in a single place, but based on the context, only portions of that can be accessed. So the employer can only see fields A and C, and the university can only see fields B and C, things like that. So it could be a matter of how we store information and contextually make bits of it available.
And Marcella, your hand is up. Did you have another question?
Yes. I don't know if you're able to answer this, but I was just curious to know. I know W3C works mostly like with websites and companies and enterprises, right? But now that we're seeing a lot of online learning, and I have some experience trying to create like an online course for our students with disabilities, I find that a lot of online learning platforms are not accessible at all, right? And at the same time, it's like two tiers. Like you have the online platform, which should be trying to strive for accessibility standards, but then you also have the side from the professors and the faculty that are posting the information, right? So I'm wondering if you guys do any sort of work in those situations where there's such a gap and there's a lot of work behind the scenes, and if the university is not really working for accessibility either, then we're not getting anywhere, right? And I've experienced it myself. We work with a learning platform that is barely accessible, and then we're trying to make our videos and content accessible, but we do it because we know it and we work in accessibility, right? But the rest of the university doesn't really know much, or is still experiencing that challenge. And I find that even if we try to make the online learning platform accessible, there's still going to be a gap because the content that is being posted on it is not.
Yes, yes, yes. So let me unpack the W3C portion of that first. So yes, the W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium. So it is the brainchild of, why am I forgetting his name at the moment? Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who formed the Web Foundation and the W3C as he officially launched what we now know as the web. And the scope of the W3C then is limited to web technologies and the web platform, because that's the arena that we serve. We are made up of members as well as community. So there are people who pay to be members of the W3C, and there are people who join for free as members of community groups. The industries served are everything that you can imagine, and the countries served are around the world. It's a global organization and it's industry agnostic, but it is web platform specific. So things like native mobile applications, things like desktop software, and other forms of information and communication technologies that do not use web technologies are not within the scope of the W3C. However, the W3C does partner on research projects, and there is a Venn diagram of overlap in other organizations that do work in accessibility. For example, in the space of XR, and I know I've mentioned that a few times, but I happen to be in that space as well. So I'm familiar with it. We have everything that has to do with XR that uses a web technology is within the purview of the W3C. But hardware manufacturers of VR headsets use local software and operating system, proprietary operating system software for those standalone devices that may or may not use web technologies. When they don't use web technologies, it's not within the scope of the W3C. However, there are other organizations like XR Access who work with hardware manufacturers and software vendors on the things that get used in this arena. So we have accessibility people within the web technology sphere and accessibility people within the hardware technology and local software and proprietary software sphere, all working to address the needs of people. It's just the parts that aren't web related aren't within the W3C. When you get to educational software, you actually enter another few layers of Venn diagram there, because there are specific laws that cover information communication technology in the realm of education that you can always point to help enforce vendors do the right thing, because they're legally obligated to, in addition to being ethically obligated to and serving a greater pool of needs. But when it is desktop software that does not use web technologies, there isn't a W3C standard that can help. There's only laws that can help.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have questions or comments? I find it just so interesting. It's vaster than I even could wrap my head around when you think about it.
Alex left a comment. Fantastic insight, Charles. Contractual conditional access, much like the ambitions of ethical contact tracing function. Thank you, Alex.
So Charles, you were saying that you're looking at reviewing these lists more often. What was the history before? How often did you look at it? And what are you considering now going forward?
That is a great question. So there is, I may butcher some of the history here because I don't have it in front of me and I can't remember all things all the time, but there was approximately a 8-year gap between WCAG 1 and WCAG 2, and approximately a 10-year gap between WCAG 2 and 2.1. 2.1 having shipped in June of 2018, and 2.2 is on its way in November of 2019. So you can see we went from 10 years to 2 years. So there's progress. However, it's still rather insufficient with the volume of new technologies and pace of change and volume of new research that becomes available to make sure that human needs are accounted for in these new technologies. So to get from an idea to a recommended technical standard, so in W3C speak, a standard when it's final is called a recommendation. To get from an idea to a recommendation takes a very long time. It takes a large volume of people having a large volume of conversations and sometimes arguments, and it takes consent, and it takes public comment. So everything that the W3C publishes as a recommendation has gone through that rigorous process. So the idea with WCAG 3 is to adopt a new process that is slightly less rigorous and more open to change. And it is a very new thing within the W3C, and it is tentatively being called the Evergreen Document Model. So basically, kind of like software gets versioned and you have a major release and then a minor release and then a break fix release, and you end up with this long string of numbers like version 84.17.6.1. We could have WCAG 3 evolve in that capacity so that there's more frequent releases under the Evergreen Document Model, instead of waiting another 2 years for one more need to get added. We could just add it along the way.
Oh, excellent. So then it's more of a living document that
will become more of exactly. It'll become more of a living document. However, that is the goal versus reality. We're not there yet, and that presents a challenge with one of our other goals, which is regulatory adoption. So we all know how long it takes government entities to adapt to change as well, right? So it took, here in the United States, we have the Access Board. So when WCAG was available, it took a long time for the Rehabilitation Act's sections 501 through 508 to actually acknowledge that there was a voluntary technical standard available. So the Section 508 refresh that happened in, I believe, 2011 finally included WCAG as the standard to meet. So that now is pointing at version 2.0. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, 2.1 was released in June of 2018, and it had 17 new criteria in it. So that means the law that took forever to adopt the previous standard still hasn't updated to the newer standard. And now we're about to release another new standard again, and it's going to take a while for law and the regulatory environment to catch up. So once we shift to a more frequent publishing model, that's going to exacerbate that problem of adoption, where which government and which law is pointing to which version of the standard.
Because I think here, I believe in our communications standard, they're still just going with WCAG 2.0.
Right, but the AODA aligns to 2.0, but the new Accessible Canada Act actually identifies 2.1. But here we are in November of this year, we'll have 2.2. How long is it going to take for that law to update?
That's the problem, is that it's always trying to catch up.
Right. So the standards will move more frequently to update new information and new needs and new methods, but adoption may not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like that in everything from web and even in the built environment. you've just got so many different perceptions of what is the standard right now. And even though standards keep changing, by the time they're implemented by government or accepted, they're
Right.
years behind.
Yeah, at least in the digital world, in web platform technologies, we don't have the grandfathered problem, where in the built environment, you can get away with not building accommodations in your building if your building is too old. We don't have that concept in the digital space. It's a requirement, period.
Correct. And I mean, we have to deal with heritage acts and all of that. Alex, do you have a question?
More of a comment and a thought actually in what you guys were just saying. So a lot of this sounds like, obviously there's the legal regulatory aspect, but from a social perspective, it's definitely falls under change management and how to get organizations and groups and sort of mini societal spaces to catch up. And I'm sure many of you have already met or are very aware of the blind advocate lawyer, David Zapowski, who he talks a lot in this space, but he started a hashtag, I think it was hashtag accessibility fail, which invited people to post every time they saw something that wasn't working or something that was an obvious deficit. And I'm mentioning this more so just to say that, like, I know people, again, I assume not all of you are in our Canadian space, but the art schools here, OCAD, FCAD at Ryerson, they all have inclusive programs, they all have accessibility programs, so there is growing awareness. But in terms of, say, it takes longer for a regulatory group to catch up, maybe the hope would be that we could go through these sort of more grassroots social means like hashtag awareness to try to get
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely agree. I think the developer community is going to adopt it immediately, but it's just going to take a while for the regulatory environment to do the same.
Right. Just thought.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Alex. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that's just a thought that I was putting out there.
Well, David had driven the AODA, and then he was actually the driving force of the Canadian Disabilities Act. So he's been really driving this force in Canada a lot. The AODA fail hashtag got a lot of steam, but there were also people using it and going after, like we said, there are some small little mom and pop shops in heritage buildings. So you can't enforce financial hardship. So say it's, it's a husband and wife running a little diner and they're making, $40,000 a year. You can't go in and demand that they put in $300,000 in say a lift, and maybe even the structure is not structurally sound to hold the weight of the lift. But we still saw people go out and do AODA fail and really affect their business. So these hashtag movements can be great, but I think we have to be a little more careful of how we're using them, that we get the context of what's going on somewhere and not just say, this doesn't suit my need, so now I'm going to put an AODA fail on it.
Right. So I actually want to address a portion of that. Yeah, I completely agree with you. We need to be more empathic and socially responsible in shaming a business for having an accessibility fail. I absolutely fully agree with that. But the undue hardship and the undue burden clause of laws, particularly in the United States under the ADA, are quite frankly bullshit when it comes to the web. So there is nothing that is cost prohibitive about making a website accessible when you do it from the ground up. In fact, it's free. The decisions that you make that lead to a failure or a barrier are the reason, not accessibility. So the cost of accessibility when you are designing and building something is zero. It's just part of the decision-making process that you go through. If you are remediating something that exists and is broken, there is incremental cost in doing that, and that cost can be 30 to 100 times what it cost in the first place, but the cause of that is not accessibility. The cause of that is you shipped something that was broken. So there is no undue burden in the cost to make that thing accessible because the cost wasn't there originally.
Well, for someone to have I don't like the term fully, but let's say fully accessible website built, costs a lot more than putting up a free one from, I don't know, Winix, I think is like a free one, whatever. They're not usually as accessible. So I hear this a lot from entrepreneurs trying to start a business. And they go, well, I can put up a free website, but I haven't got the 8 to 10,000 to put up a one-page accessible website.
Right. So again, that goes back to the decision. That was a choice to select a free thing that was broken. So there are many ways to have that argument, but the cost of accessibility as an undue burden for digital things is moot. It's a non-issue. It's so easy to disprove.
Do you mind if I, because I love this, absolutely love this conversation. So my work is user research and usability, and I have a background sort of social psychology, so I'm kind of looking at it from both these sides. And Charles, everything you're saying about remediation, it's funny because for sure, all of these decisions, the big thing that always gets said is bring us on early, bring it in as part of the research, start at the beginning rather than as an afterthought. And one of the counter arguments, not argument, but one of the things I often say is, I wouldn't really have a job if everyone was aware. Not as a good thing, but just that's kind of
I'd love to work myself out of a job.
Exactly.
It's
that's
solved.
the honest
Digital accessibility, we done.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is there is that intersection where, as there's more social awareness, so not just the regulatory enforcement, which obviously is essential, but as there's more social awareness, hopefully that would mean people would make that decision correctly more often, and it wouldn't take, say, for example, retraining people or advocacy or the AODA failed or shaming to kind of push that. And then I guess the regulatory aspect is sort of that for anyone that's really resistant or just completely unaware, that's that sort of heavier-handed way of, I guess, forcing the issue. But that's just how I took everything you guys were just talking about.
Yeah, and then even for someone, a small mom and pop business who is faced with having to go through a remediation process on a website, and they spent virtually nothing on it on the first place because they didn't have it and they're a bootstrapped business and they went with a free template service somewhere, and now they're facing having to do something about it. There are an overwhelming volume of methods to approach that problem that still probably end up costing them nothing. Number one, if that mom and pop business is in the United States, there's a $5,000 tax credit to make your property accessible. And by property, that includes websites. Number two is open source the site and throw it out to the community. There are tens of thousands of people that want to work in this space that would be happy to jump into a GitHub repository and fix your site for you.
Amazing.
But you know, I think the problem is people don't even know these exist. This
Right. So it's an
this is
education problem, not an undue burden of cost problem.
correct, yes. And really, shouldn't all of these companies, if they're providing something for free, let's be honest, nothing is free. So they are making money somewhere. Should not the burden be on them to provide an accessible product?
Absolutely, and that gets distributed, and there's legal precedent for that here in the U.S. I believe in the 9th District Court in California. I can't remember. It's a retailer's case from 2017 or 2018, where the platform, as well as the host, the development service. So the business, the developer, and the platform were all cited in the suit. So if you are a platform providing these templated services, like you know, I don't want to name them all, but they're out there. You go and find a you know, a service that you can pick a free template from and launch it. That's what that means by platform in that legal precedent. So absolutely, there is responsibility and culpability and legal precedent for the platform itself sharing part of that burden. And I don't know all of the details on case law in Canada, but I'm very fluent in it here in the United States. And sorry, I accidentally hit mute. I'm very familiar with the law here in the United States, and people tend to misunderstand or have a flawed belief in the cost of going to court, where there are no damages in an ADA Title III website accessibility case in the United States in federal court. There, you do not have any compulsory or punitive or monetary damages of any kind. You only have, and now I'm forgetting the term, the requirement to remediate the problem. The only actual cost associated with going to court over a website accessibility case is legal fees. If you end up going to court and you lose, you end up having to pay the plaintiff's attorney fees. The rest of the expense comes in the fact that you still have to fix the site. That's the result of the court case, is you have to make it accessible no matter what. So it doesn't behoove anyone to go through court to do that. If you get a complaint or a demand letter or a customer coming to you in a friendly way, respond to that. Admit it's broken, fix the problem, and move on. Going through court just means you're going to pay someone else's attorney.
So true. And I like how you say, you know what, bring it to their attention in a friendly way first. Like, I'm a believer in that. If I see something wrong, I'm a believer in what Gandhi had said, be the change you wish to see in the world. So see first if it's something I can personally fix. And if not, go bring it to the person's attention and give them that opportunity. I'd like to err on the side of maybe they weren't aware. Maybe they were, and whatever, but I always believe in give the person the chance. And reward good. Like I try to do the reward good. So I will actually use AODA pass or AODA win. If I see something good, I'll say, oh, you've done a great job. Whether it's through your physical accessibility or the sound, the acoustics, etc. So I'll use that. And I think we need both of that out there. Yes, we have to call people out, but we can't just always point fingers,
Right.
because as sure as you're pointing one forward, there's others coming back. So
Yeah, there's actually a standard method that's a middle ground in all of this, which is something that's recommended within the digital accessibility community, and it's simply have an accessibility statement on your website. And inside of that statement, provide contact information. Should someone face a barrier, here's who to contact, and we will help you remedy it. If you simply offer to help someone remedy a barrier that they encounter, they will use that channel and not even, like, go down the path of being angry or seeking to file some sort of complaint. They're on the website to do a thing. They encountered a barrier. They can't do that thing. They easily found contact information to help them get around that barrier. They used it. Problem solved.
excellent. And does anybody else got a comment or a question? And Alex, go ahead.
Sorry to keep jumping in.
Oh, no, go for it.
So just one more sort of integrating thought around what you guys were just saying. I've been looking. I mean, I keep hearing website obviously as the main example coming to mind, and then spatial, architecture, design environments. The space I often look at would be that in between, where it's a device, it could be mobile app, it could be more hardware oriented, and I keep thinking like GPS devices, hands-free audio sets, those kind of spaces where it might be in a more, not volatile, but more sensitive environment like driving or whatnot, where if something was missed, if a feature isn't done quite correctly, I still carry around this really old GPS that has a locking feature that just is absolutely unusable. And I mean, I'm not trying to, bring up the edge cases. I just could imagine there would be some times where something might get missed and not an obvious way to resolve it. This is all just sort of, again, edge cases.
Yeah, so I don't think it's an edge case, and I think we are going to continue to see more and more blurred lines there with the Internet of Things. So any device that provides any portion of its service using a web technology, regardless of whether or not that presents on a screen, is covered within accessibility guidelines from the W3C. So we are in WCAG 3 attempting to account for Internet of Things devices when they use web technologies. So for example, a Nest thermostat, it has a screen, it has a user interface that is both physical and digital, and it records information and data and then posts that information over a local Wi-Fi network through a web service back through to the cloud to be owned. That portion of that service that uses web technologies is covered by web standards. Now, the digital interface that you see on the hardware that is not relying on web technology and is all local isn't covered by the same set of standards, but the same principles can apply to it.
Good food for thought.
Very interesting. I think this conversation could go on for hours.
I think if we've exhausted the comment and question on the functional needs and we're just socializing, then feel free to find a point to call it a wrap. But again, the W3C process that this list of functional needs is most likely to go through next is to become an editor's draft and that editor's draft will then be published for public comment. But I am making public comment available before we even get to that point. So you've now been shared a resource that has the full list within it. And you have my contact information, and I'm happy to take any of that comment.
Excellent. And I mean, sometimes things come to people later, so gladly reach out to Charles. So we're getting great session. Thank you. Sorry. So if there's no more comments or questions, it is 9 o'clock. I want to thank you so much, Charles. Very, very informative.
Happy to able to share this work and talk about it.
Sorry about that. My voice, I have a voice myoplasty to speak. Now it's really drying out. So with that, I guess we will call it an evening. I want to thank everybody for attending, and especially thank you, Charles.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yep.